Hi, everybody. This is Mark, and welcome back to Beyond Profit, Global Perspective. And we're going to continue talking about culture. This is the second video that we're doing. If you haven't had a chance to watch the first one, I suggest you go back and do that first. That will help this video make a little bit more sense. So in the last video, we were talking about cultural differences, more from an attitudinal perspective. That is, what attitudes do Americans have about the rest of the world? What kinds of stereotypes and generalizations do they hold? How does the rest of the world respond to Americans? And there's this chasm sometimes between the way we see each other. And as a result, it sometimes can create situations where if you are a traveler or a professional or somebody who's going to another country and you see something that's different, it may break your social norms. It may challenge the things that you think are normal and expected, and it may make things very awkward for you. This knowledge, hopefully, will allow you to adjust yourself. If you have a better sense of what other people think of Americans, especially some of the negative stereotypes, then maybe you can do some things in order to try to overcome those and make adjustments to improve your opportunities, your abilities to create social connections. And there's some things that are just really hard to get over, right? There's cultural challenges, there's political challenges, and so the more you are self-aware, the more you will be able to adjust and move into new situations with confidence. So what we're going to do in the next video here, that's this video, is talk a little bit more about cultural behavioral differences and how they can be surprising, how they can be shocking. But once again, we'll come back to this theme of adjustment. How do you adjust to the fact that there's a lot of people behaving in ways that you're not used to? So let's roll this. I'd invite you to please like and subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave some comments below. That will allow me to know maybe about some things you'd like to learn more about. Certainly you can ask me questions. I'd like to engage with you. And here's a thought. If you're interested in pursuing your education further, come to the University of St. Mary. Come study with me. I'd be happy to have you as my student and help develop you in your future career prospects. So I just mentioned that in the previous video we talked about perceptions and how that can create problems, and then in this video we're going to talk more about behaviors. So we're not just talking about behaviors of people in different cultures and how that might be challenging, but also what your behavior might be like. And a big theme here is going to be the question of how do you prepare yourself for an overseas assignment? And so this video is going to be broken up into sections based on those recommendations. So my first recommendation is you do your research. Second, be flexible, adaptive, sensitive, curious. And third, immerse yourself enthusiastically. So let's start with doing your research. In this situation, we're going to be looking at different ways that people communicate with each other that's different, or in some cases, just different cultural practices that you may not be used to, but it might be really helpful for you to know about some things, at least examples of those things, so you know how to prepare. First time I was outside the country was in Russia. We talked about this. Second time I went outside the country, like I said, not counting Canada or Mexico, which is its own story, I went to the UK, and I didn't prepare at all. Didn't care. I'm just like, I've seen enough British movies. It's like the 51st state as far as I'm concerned. They're like Americans with a funny dialect, It's all right. And I went there and I'm like, no, this place is really freaking different. It's really unique. It's very special. And so I didn't go in there with, I was just, I don't know, I figured this is going to be my playground. I didn't really take it probably as seriously as I ought to. And I learned from that experience that really I ought to do better. I wasn't being an ugly American or anything. I loved the place. I was in love with the place. But yeah, so I did much better after that. And since then, every time I've gone outside the country, I've tried to learn as much about the culture as I possibly can, learn as much of the language as I think I can handle given the amount of time that I have. I mean, you can't be fluent in a language in a short period of time, but that sort of stuff does help, I think. One of the first cultural differences you have to deal with when you go elsewhere in the world is social distance. Now, when I went to, I think it was Egypt, I don't think it was Turkey, but Egypt, I'm pretty sure. I was, of course, doing my cultural preparation, doing all the things you're supposed to do, try to get ready for this thing. And I thought I was doing well. And I go in to negotiate something with somebody, and it was an Egyptian guy. And as we were negotiating, right, he was talking to me, and he would get close. And then he comes around and sort of like kind of gets in my face, and he's talking to me and stuff. And my sort of initial thought is like, this guy seems kind of threatening. I don't know. Wasn't even conscious about it, but I just sort of like kind of did this thing where, I kind of come over here to the side, stand next to him, and then of course he comes around here like this. And I wasn't noticing at first, okay? But this guy, then he came around and he was like this. Oh. And then I was like this, right? Next thing you know, I'm over here and he's like here. Sooner or later, we were doing this little circular dance here. He's chasing me around the room and he keeps talking to me. It took me a while for me to realize I keep moving around. I realized that I missed this sort of key cultural thing, and that is that social distance is different. Americans and Northern Europeans tend to have sort of a similar notion of social distance, right? This is a public distance, right? A more personal distance between two people will still be about this far apart, right? Like intimate distance is like, if I'm having a conversation with somebody, it's going to be like this, especially if it's another dude, okay? Women have slightly closer social distances and can approach each other a little bit differently, but like with men, it's like, all right, you're not going to go face to face usually, and certainly not a close face to face, right? You're going to be side to side. If there's any body language, body contact, you're maybe nudging, you're shaking hands, this kind of thing, but that's not true in all places of the world. As you go into Southern Europe and you go to the Middle East, that social distance is a whole lot closer. Like, oh, geez, okay, I am not being culturally sensitive, so I just stood there while he was like this. Next thing I knew, I just had to like stand there and let the dude talk to me, and I'm like, And it got done. It was fine. I didn't offend him. I don't think he really realized that, and it took me a few minutes to realize I was doing it too, but that's just, it's cultural differences, right? I was not completely prepared for that, right? And sometimes those things will throw you off. So another cultural difference and challenge that we often face is a misinterpretation of gestures. And speaking of that, we all know what this means in the United States and in many Western states. It's like, that's cool, thumbs up. Hey, again, Facebook, you just click the little thumbs up button. Happy days, you're cool like Fonzie. Hey, right? Okay, so positive things, good things, thumbs up is great. It can also mean something else. There was a time where the United States invaded the country of Iraq in the early 2000s. And when the U.S. troops were pulling through there, they were being greeted as liberators, according to the media, because all of the people on the streets were like going like this. And it's not necessarily a good thing when lots of people are jumping up and going like this when you're in Iraq, because in America this might mean, hey, you're cool like Fonzie, but in Iraq it sort of means more like, I don't know, what's the American equivalent? And we're like, hey, they think we're cool like Fonzie. That is not what they were saying. But yeah, the whole U.S. media was like, oh, look at that, wow. And so it's kind of fun. Now, of course, I'm sure that a lot of those people knew what it meant in America too, or maybe they just had a lot of fun playing around with it, like, Americans don't know what this means here. Other gestures that are considered to be, interpreted differently from one culture to another. One is the A-OK sign. I just realized I'm going to be offending half of my viewers if you guys are outside the country, but bear with me. The A-OK sign, hey, pretty cool. Oh, it's that thumb again. Can't do that. The A-OK sign symbolizes a body orifice in Greece, Spain, and Brazil, an insult to LGBTQ in Turkey, and indicates the evil eye in Middle Eastern countries. Of course, many of you in the United States and Western countries may be familiar with this meaning yes and this meaning no. In some parts of the world, particularly Greece and Bulgaria, it is exactly the opposite. So it's yes. No. Oh, can't do it. No. It's hard to frown and do this at the same time. It's so culturally ingrained, right? Come here gesture. That is, of course, like I said, in Western culture, sort of suggests come here, right? It's forbidden in many Asian nations, reserved for dogs in many areas. It's offensive and may even be considered assault. It's also considered a rude gesture in Slovakia, Eastern Asia, and Singapore. I also know in some parts of the world, like when I've been around the Middle East, when you beckon someone to follow you, it isn't necessarily like this. Sometimes they stretch out the arm behind you and signal with you by shaking your hand like this. Another thing that sometimes is interpreted differently based on your culture is the tendency to talk with the hands. I mean, these people should not be watching any of my videos because I can't hardly keep my hands still. So here I go, sit on my hands for this part. In Japan, it's considered impolite. In Northern European countries, the gestures make you appear perhaps insincere or overly dramatic, lessening the impact of the comments you're making to a client. Here's another word of advice. Do not shake someone's hand with your left hand in the Middle East. Where is the left hand considered unclean and extremely rude to handshake, pass food, or wave? Okay, the answer is Arab nations. Does anybody happen to know why it is that the left hand is considered to be rude? So the answer is that when one uses the toilet, there isn't toilet paper in every country in the world and all other places, and one cleans oneself with the left hand, considered to be unclean. People tend to cross their legs differently depending on what part of the world they are in. Sometimes women cross their legs differently from men. Americans cross their legs differently from Europeans. But did you know that it's offensive in some Middle Eastern countries to expose the sole of the foot? Very rude. Exposing the soles of one's shoes or feet. You pointed out that it's sort of strangely specific about like crossing your legs, right? There are certain ways that you shouldn't cross your legs in Middle Eastern countries, right? Like in America, we cross our legs like this if you're a man, right? There's various reasons for that. I don't want to get into it. But this would be offensive to our Arab friends, right? So, ow, ow. Okay. This is how one should then cross one's leg if that's what you want to do. Another thing is that in some Asian countries, a business card is not just a business card. It is sometimes an extension of yourself. So if you meet an Asian business person and they hand you their business card, you should take it in your hand, hold it with both hands, look at it, examine it, regard it. The American tendency, like when I hand somebody my business card or somebody hands it back to me, it's like, oh, great, thanks, and you sort of tuck it away because you'll get back around to it later. But if somebody sees this as like something very special, something that they really spent time on, something that like it portrays who they are, culturally speaking, you really shouldn't insult them by just sort of tossing it away quickly. Some people take titles and honorifics a whole lot more seriously than we do here in the United States. Some people need to have a formal title, like a Mr. or a Doctor or something like that in front of their name, or else you're really not offering them respect. And whereas you might feel like, hey, I'm willing to sort of call that person by their formal title, it's no big deal because we're more egalitarian, we're more laid back and casual. Well, some people just aren't quite that way. I definitely want to point out this thing regarding titles. There are certain cultures where titles are very important. We take things very casually in the United States. We call people by their first name. I went to the Philippines and they had a hard time with that. I tried to get them sort of like, oh, just call me Mark. I'm just a guy. But they couldn't look at me that way. So instead of calling me Mr. Harvey or Dr. Harvey, they had to settle for some other title, so they called me Manon Mark, which means brother Mark. So they had to have a title. It was part of that thing. So I probably should have been more sensitive and just like, hey, go ahead, call me whatever. But sometimes those terms of respect are very, very important to certain cultures. Be flexible, adaptive, sensitive, curious. I think these are all good qualities when you go to a situation that you're not familiar with, and if you want to get the most out of it, then that's what you want to have. But even with all of the preparation and all the time that you think you can do, there's still going to be missteps. There's still going to be things that you do that you just don't know about and you can't know about. And, it's unknowable whether or not that one thing that you do or don't do is going to alienate somebody to try to, prevent something bad from happening. But you also don't know necessarily how much grace someone is willing to give you, because if you're trying hard and you're making a mistake, then, maybe they'll get past it, right? Maybe it'll be okay. Or maybe it'll be a funny thing that it's a point of connection. Do you think that real business deals are sometimes, they come together despite differences because maybe there's a common interest? I mean, there's lots of deals that sometimes happen despite the fact that people still feel culturally superior, they still are unnecessarily aggressive and insensitive. Sometimes they also don't go that way because you make somebody mad and that common interest goes away because somebody gets insulted. So that's real life. My experience was and continues to be that when you try hard, most people are going to be very forgiving. Even French people, in my experience. And this was in Paris, and they're dealing with tourists all the time, and so they probably don't really have the same kind of patience as other people maybe in other parts of the country might have. I didn't know that much French to start with, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and my wife and I, we were traveling through, and we just figured we were going to do the best we could. And there was one point where we're like going back and forth across a train station trying to figure out where we're going, and we want to ask somebody directions, and we stop and we start to speak in French, and she sort of like politely stands there and looks at us and then instead says, "Oh, it's okay, I speak English." And and she's very helpful and kind of pointing us out, and I think she liked the fact that we were trying, right? We went into, I remember, one of these little places where you can get your bread and your cheese, tiny little place. And, they weren't going to speak English for us, but it didn't matter. Like, we could write a word down on a piece of paper and do this. We kind of caveman our way through, bread, cheese, learn whatever the word is for that and grunt it out there and give them the money and make it work. Some cultural adaptation strategies. How do you get past some of those differences? There are several suggestions that I might make. One would be to assume multiple identities, right? We talked about in a previous week about the stereotypes that people have about each other. We Americans have them about people in other cultures, other people in other cultures have them about Americans, right? We also talked about how even whoever the president of the United States is can be stuck to you in one way or another, and that can sometimes be an albatross when it comes to trying to do business or try to get to know people, right? But those are sometimes questions of identity. That is to say, you're an American, I am a Saudi Arabian, I am going to have a problem with you as an American because XYZ, right? And so that's sometimes a clash of identities. And if you stick on that national identity sort of thing, and then sometimes you're not going to get anywhere, right? It will create more conflict than cooperation. But what's nice about identities is if they're flexible, then you can create inclusive identities as well, right? I get past the national thing. Hey, do you have kids? How many kids do you have, right? I share my identity with someone as a father, someone else who can relate to me of having kids and worrying about them or caring about them or whatever. So I've shifted to a different thing that I might have in common with that person. Hey, Do you like soccer? Do you like football, right? What's your team, right? So I identify with somebody maybe as a sports fan, right? There's a different kind of an identity I can go for. So trying to find those areas that you have in common, other things that people love as much as you love, and bonding with them in that way. In that way, identities don't have to be divisive. They can be unifying. And so trying to figure that out in whatever culture you're in is a way to sort of make that work. Being a business person, right? If you're doing a deal and there's one business person here and you're the other one, you have a common interest maybe in making money and making something work, if nothing else. I mean, it's great to find other areas of commonality, but sometimes that's sufficient. A second is beware of a Western bias toward getting the job done. We've already talked about multiple cultures that move things along a lot more slowly, right? You come into in a Turkey, you're going to have tea with somebody before you make a deal. You go to China, you're going to meet with people maybe more than once before you even start talking about whether or not there's going to be a transaction involved. So, in the United States, we have this sort of laser focused on like, okay, let's just work the deal and get it done and go on to the next one, and that's just not the way it is everywhere. Third, avoid the tendency to formulate simple, consistent, stable images, right? We talk about stereotypes, but it is more than that, I would say. And that, like, let's say that you're doing your cultural research and you're trying to be sensitive, you're trying to do all the right thing, and you're like, okay, well, in this culture, you're supposed to bring a gift if you go to somebody's house, right? It's possible that you go there and you bring a gift to somebody's house and they're like, oh, that's nice, I didn't really expect that, right? Just because you're reading an information on a country doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be true in all of its localities. It doesn't mean that it's true about every family that's out there. Sometimes your best efforts at being sensitive sometimes are not exactly what you thought. And so you kind of have to be open and flexible and realize that you can't learn everything about a place. You do your best, but sometimes you just get there and you kind of got to roll. And that's just part of it. Not all aspects of culture are equally important. We talked about some offensive forms of culture, right? Certain hand gestures, or like exposing your foot if you're in the Middle East and that kind of thing, right? But also realize that there are different elements of culture that are more offensive than others. So I might think that one thing is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that person did that. And another thing might be like, stupid American, that's funny, right? So stupid American that's funny is okay, right? You can get a laugh out of it, and that's all right. But you have to try to avoid the ones that really are offensive, because who knows? Sometimes that awkwardness promotes some laughs and some connections, right? You're not perfect, and it's okay not to be perfect. Norms toward outsiders may be different than norms toward insiders. There are places where, as I think we discussed before, there's places where it's expected that Americans are going to dress like Americans, and you don't want to buck that tradition because it's like that's, they're going to think it's weird if that's what you expect. But there are also situations where it might be better to blend in, so figuring out when those times are and so on is an important thing to check out. In the Philippines, you might be okay, wearing a barong to certain events because it's local, and that's understandable, right? In other situations, you go to Saudi Arabia and you're wearing a Bedouin headscarf, and that might not be the thing to do when you're doing a business deal, right? So they may not want you to look like them. They may not want you to act like them. They may just want you to be who you are. You're the outsider, and they're going to evaluate you differently. If you're a woman who's a business person and you're working overseas, a lot of people learn to respect that even if it's outside their culture, because they just understand that that is the norm from the other place, and they just have to deal with it. We could never have women in business here, but they'll take you because you're an American, because that's the way you do things, and if you want to do the deal, then that's the way they're going to have to deal with it. And so I would say, like, if you're a woman, you're a business person, do not let that stop you, right? Go fight, win. But it's also challenging sometimes, right? Just like, geez, being a woman in this culture is challenging. Don't overestimate your familiarity with the culture. You may think that you know your way around stuff, but I will say that unless you've really lived at a place, and probably lived at a place for a long time, or even been born and raised at a place, it's really hard to just say that you're a native, to really have that level of familiarity. So I think there's a lot of people who get close to it. If they live a place for a long time, they speak the language fluently, you can get much closer to it. But there's still going to be things that you're learning. And so just assume that you're always going to be learning a little bit. And I would say immerse yourself enthusiastically, right? Love and celebrate that place that you are and just, get into it, enjoy it. Cool new experiences change you in positive ways, right? It's great. I think it's incredibly confidence building when you get outside of wherever you are and then you learn something new, you deal with a new system, and then you realize, hey, I can do this, and you do this thing. Like I was telling you before about education, sometimes the things that are hard are the things that really transform you the most. I remember my wife talking about going to London for the first time, and it was her first time overseas, and she went with a group of students, and she was very intimidated by the experience at first. But then, over the period of being there for a few weeks, it's like, okay, well, now I'm going to go off on my own, and now I'm going to learn my way around the transport system, and I can get a bus, and I know how to do this, and you sort of learn, and through that, she became very excited about the world, and very confident about her skills in navigating all kinds of places. What's going to come next is I want to talk a little bit more about culture, and then when we get into marketing and we get into HR, then I want you to put on your cultural hat and think about how people from different points of view, from different perspectives, from different parts of the world might look at these same things that, maybe we take these things for granted as business people, as people who are about to get your MBA, as business people. There's certain things we believe, we know, and we operate this way in our own home country. But you go someplace else and it changes and it's different. And so how will your business practices change? How will your product change? How will the way you treat employees change, right? All of that is a reflection of the differences that you have when you go to different parts of the world. When you go to that situation that is challenging, that's outside your comfort zone, I want you to prepare, I want you to adapt, and I want you to immerse yourself. That's the best way to go about it, right? Don't be afraid. There are lots of things out there to be afraid of, but these new challenges, look at it as a new opportunity, as a new exciting thing you can do. And you can do it through thorough preparation by being flexible and just being enthusiastic about the experience. You can get a great experience. So, for that, I'll say goodbye, and I will see you next time.